After the house was sold, we drove north to Omri, a cinematic place at the western end of Loch Tay. My head had been full of grey, a sky with no sunshine, and Alex thought the change of scene might help turn me back into myself. It was March, suddenly. The year was pulling at its reins. Alex had surprised me with a crumpled printout, brandished like a long-stemmed rose. He knew our destination well, having grown up nearby, and he knew that I had taken that holiday there with my family. So it was a meaningful place for both of us. We kept pausing on the drive up, so he could get out of the car with his camera and marvel at all his old haunts. It was getting dark when Alex spotted the sign for the village. The apartment, one portion of a steading conversion, was waiting at the end of a mile-long track, the forest deepening on either side. He negotiated a sloping turn, his eyes turning to seeds as the Panda bumped down through a wrought-iron gate towards a paved yard. A woman was making her way towards us. "Mr. and Mrs. Kareem. Kit Ross. We met over the internet." She was 60-ish, soft face with giant grips in her piled hair. She glanced over as I made my way around from the passenger side. "This is Jamie, by the way," Alex said, reaching behind him. "It is so nice to meet you, Jamie." If she was taken aback by me not being a Mrs., she didn't show it. "You're the first of the season." She moved into the vestibule, snapping on the light. "There now. I've got the place all cozy and warm for you." The apartment was compact. Alex had to duck as we peeked through the bedroom door. I felt my limbs turn heavy at the sight of the king-size bed. Everything bland like a show house, save for the mini zoo of stuffed animals plonked along the window ledge. There were dogs, cats, a gorilla, and a giraffe. 3 bears, the baby, nuzzled between its parents. "It all looks very smart," I said, following her into the kitchen. Kit Ross was gazing up at Alex, her head tilted like a connoisseur. There are so few like him, with that hair, black like you've never seen black before, and his newsreader's voice. The clothes he wore accentuated his height: drainpipes, vertical stripes, and boots with pointed toes. One hand, the pink of his fingernails peeking through the chipped black, brushed mine. Kit Ross launched into an interrogation. How was our journey? Did we have plans? How was the weather in London? We had spent the previous week in Edinburgh, I told her, though I stopped short of telling her why. Alex frilled his fingers at Kit as she passed by the kitchen window at the back of the apartment. We heard a door unlocking and then the creak of her footsteps. "My God, she really is right next door," Alex said. "We're going to have to make out so quietly." I unpacked and cooked, while Alex got the fire going in the living room, then walked his mobile around the apartment until it chirped into life. He cast an eye over the leaflets Kit had left. "We could take a walk along the old railway line tomorrow. Have a go at finding this house of yours. I mean, if you think you're up to it." "I'm fine," I said. That night, as I was sitting up in bed and staring off, I felt him looking at me. "I was thinking about my dad," I said. "I was trying to picture him. Just when I think I've got him clear in my head, it's like he shrinks and loses all his dimensions, you know? Like one of those wee men cut out of paper." Alex put aside his phone. "I'm sorry I never got to meet them." "They were good people." I wanted to talk more, to tell Alex about my mum and my dad, but which version to choose? So instead, I kissed him and told him good night before turning onto my side. And when I heard his breathing change, I raised myself to my elbows. His sleeping face. It almost made me want to dig out my sketch pad just so I could draw him. Outside, the rain picked up. It rustled against the window. The 3 bears watched from the window ledge. Somebody has been sleeping in my bed. I felt smaller than ever, For a long time, we lived in the flat above my parents' newsagents. If you crossed the road, a cobbled close led through to Holyrood Park and the wall that ran along the back of the palace. If you walked to the top of the road, you could see Arthur's Seat, the lounging giant, its head visible above the tenements and surveying the shoppers on London Road. Lying in bed, I strained to listen to them, chuckling at some mysterious joke or sharing problems of a work-domestic nature that were beyond me. These seemed more than two people who shared a marriage and a shop. They were best friends, a double act, so close that the boundaries between them were almost irrelevant. At cashing up time, as the till churned out the day's receipts, I would sit through the back, scarfing crisps and doing homework, or reading my way through the tied stacks of magazines, Women's Own, Women's Weekly, and The People's Friend. It was there, aged 8 or 9, that I found a new title, For Women, and opened it. There was Todd, that month's full frontal centrefold. With his rigid hair and ludicrously square jaw, Todd looked like a cartoon hero only with glossy pubes, a sponge-like scrotum, and a belly that seemed to go on forever. I shut the magazine, breathed, then peeped again. Without thinking, I tore him from the magazine. My heart thrilled. I knew this was something my parents wouldn't like, that it was something I should not be doing. That leaf of flimsy paper was the first thing that came between us. The first in a career of secrets. It wasn't until a few years later, long after I had moved away, that I realized I could make my childhood into stories for other people's amusement. I have always drawn, and I especially love drawing people. My portraits are sometimes cartoonish, or they can be hyper-realistic, but I have tried, not to make my parents into caricatures. They sold the shop in the mid-noughties and moved to a slender new build. The day after my mother's funeral, I took Alex to visit the shop, only to discover that it was gone. No rubble, just a larger-than-usual gap between the tenements, but nothing you would notice if you weren't looking for it. I felt as though the world had changed, but subtly, as though it had been tilted or shifted a few degrees. Something woke me. A beat or a breath. For a couple of scary moments, I tried to locate familiar things. We had come on holiday. That was it. We'd fetched up in a room filled with teddies in someone else's house in the middle of a forest. I soon found myself at the kitchen table, turning pages. The book was a treasury of fairy tales. My parents' message, etched in biro across the top of the first page. To Jamie, happy 5th birthday. Love from Mummy and Daddy. Kiss, kiss. When I found this book in a drawer in their house, I had hugged it like it was a living thing. I had always loved its frightening pictures. To this day it conjures bedtime safety, the delight of fear. For now, it was consolation. When I opened the book, my parents came wafting into the room. They were such careful people, but they could never think of cigarettes as dangerous. I remember sitting cross-legged in bed, listening to them on the other side of the wall. They were worrying about something. They worried about everything. A picture came into my head. Hansel and Gretel with their arms around each other, their doll features filled with terror, listening at the top of the stairs as the woodcutter and his wife hatched their plot to abandon the children in the woods. Now I scoured until I found the right page. I gazed like a fond father at the children's hamster cheeks. "What are we going to do now?" said the little boy. "We're all alone." I cannot remember many conversations that didn't come back round to money. I have a memory of my parents sitting hunched over their books long into the evening, lost in fine margins, raddled by constant effort. My mother had this incredible full-throated chuckle, and when my father laughed, his whole head went back. Seeing them like this, limp with laughter, made me want to keep telling them the best joke they'd ever heard. I had seen that they were often wound tight with worry. Now I thought it was my job to make light, to lighten them. Let there be light. My dad said it every evening when he turned on the big lamp in the living room, splaying his fingers like a magician. Their local sat in a corner at the top of the hill. It was famous for its folk club, which met in a room at the back of the pub. Fridays, at the end of the month, meant carry-out nights. Sometimes these took place in our flat, feet trampling the stairs and cans rattling in the hallway. On carry-out nights, talk often turned to politics. All my parents' friends were Labour, even the ones who didn't work. For my parents, Labour meant always being prepared for life's many disappointments. "Ach, well," they said, when they woke to see John Major waving and grinning from the steps of number 10. And then the dial on the telly would be turned and the dread thing would disappear, replaced by something safer, easier to thole. Councillor Waddell made regular appearances at carry-out nights. He flitted from group to group, the knot of his tie protruding over the neck of his red jumper. I'd heard my mother's friend Isabel whispering that she thought Councillor Waddell was a little light in his loafers. I stared at his brogues, unclear what she meant. One night, I realised with a thump that he was looking at me. He bounded over. "Can it be Jamie? Your mother must have put you in the grow bag." I could feel her gently prodding my back. Yes, thanks," I said. "Tell Councillor Waddell your news," my mother chimed. I was 10 years old. There wasn't much to report. My mother's whispered prompts slipped over my shoulder. Science project, short story competition, history test. "Bravo, good for you, Jamie," he said. "Louis and Matthew, you must be very proud of this boy." He held out his bottle of lager to tap against my lemonade, and as the glass chinked, I accidentally let go a cackle of pleasure. Councillor Waddell made the front page of the Evening News some years later. The article said that he had been discovered performing a sex act on another man in the woods next to a play park. My parents were reluctant to talk about what had happened. I wanted to know more about what Councillor Waddell had been doing in those woods. I asked my mum if he and his wife were still together. She took her time in answering. "Helen Waddell. She's a mousy wee thing. I can't imagine how she must be feeling." She shook her head. "Rotten bugger." My mother rarely, if ever, swore. "Alex?" I wrestled free from the duvet, a childish feeling in my belly. But he was there, perched in the kitchen, the damp thatch combed back from his face. "How long did you say we've got this place for?" I asked him. "I've booked it for the week. When are you due back?" Bannerman told me I could take as long as I needed. I had gone back to work 10 days after my mother's funeral. I told myself I was fine. For a while, I was fine. It was lunchtime, and the canteen was mobbed. A colleague saw me standing in the middle of the floor, leaning at an impossible angle. I had forgotten some detail. The exact way my mum held her hand to her chest when she laughed, or my father's habit of soothing his nose with his finger when he took off his glasses. I wanted so much to remember. Bannerman appeared and huckled me into her office. "Do you have someone, a friend you'd like me to call and have come and pick you up?" I hadn't been that physically close to Bannerman since my interview 6 years earlier. "I feel like I've got something heavy in my head. A great fuck-off boulder, rocks in my chest and stones in my throat, and they keep getting bigger and heavier. I wish they would just burst, breaking me open, letting my insides spill out onto your nice beige carpet. All that anger, all the sadness gone. That would feel good, I think. I'd feel light again. I'm fine, I said. I'll be fine. I left her office just as the bell rang. Bannerman had suggested in her classroom voice that I take time off, and I said yes. Why not? With a little inward slump. We need to get you back into a routine, I heard Alex say. Like a child. Like an old person. I crossed my arms, pretending not to have heard. You go and get your armour on, Alex said. I'll get our boots from the car. How long had we been together now? 10? 11 months? He used to come into Ground Up in Bayswater, where a few of us from school would gather for lunch on a Friday. He and the rest of the team from the cleaning company would be there at the end of their shift, giggling wearily into their lattes. I noticed his height and the rose gold of his skin, the piercings, and that military way he carried himself with his shoulders back and his chin out. One day, I caught him looking past his friends, finding my eyes. I joined him at the counter when he went up to pay. Quieter the day, he said. And there it was. The accent. You're Scottish? He told me he was an actor. Can't you tell? He said, flapping the front tail of his tabard. We went back to his flat in Stoke Newington. His torso seemed designed to slot into his lower half like the plastic trunk of an action figure. He saw that I was self-conscious about my middle, this podge I sometimes get, and he let his lips linger. Before climbing on top, he asked did I mind if he came on my belly. He might have been asking if he could open the window and let in some air. Look at me, he said. Look at me. We came, one after the other, a pair of controlled explosions. We clung to each other like a couple of happy drunks. I made my thrice-weekly phone call to my parents a couple of nights later. I had to cut the conversation short because I was running late to meet him. The line went quiet. Don't think we know an Alex, do we? Where's he come from? I come from the kingdom on the other side of the forest. I'm sure I must have mentioned him before. My tone was devil-may-care, and of course they couldn't see my great big grin. Alex was leaning over the car, studying the map. I tottered out onto the courtyard in my new boots, a kid trying out his mother's heels for the first time. He looked pristine in his yellow raincoat and black beanie, a catalogue idea of a rambler. Okay, this is the way to the old railway line, up here. Come on, it'll be grand. Let's get our legs going. It'll be grand. He said the same thing when he asked me to live with him. I didn't answer right away. We hadn't been together very long. It was just after my dad died. Living together was a change I wasn't sure I was ready for. Come on, it'll be an adventure. For a while I had thought him confident, bordering on cocky. It had taken a while to notice the crinkles of uncertainty around his eyes. He seemed genuinely unaware of his insane beauty. So I'm 99% sure your house is just up ahead. We had finally come out of the trees. A sign rose out of the ground. Fairmount. Fairmount was apparently a small estate with boxy new builds stacked all the way up the hill. Alex craned his neck. What did you say the house looked like? It was just a white cottage on its own on the hillside with a clear view over to the loch in the hills. He stretched and tried to see over the tops of houses, to whatever might be hiding behind the shoulder of the hill. You went there just the once, he said. I remember it so well, I said abruptly, as though trying to convince myself that the house did in fact exist. I had a big room to myself. It felt huge, and I remember seeing all kinds of things in the dark. Nightmares. My mother said I had an overactive imagination, beasties behind the curtains and things with fangs at the end of the bed. I never wanted to be left alone. Alex looked at me. He took my hand, lifting his eyes to meet mine. Maybe you misremembered? How do you mean? The house. We're talking, what, 20 years ago? Maybe, I said. I really wanted to show you. In Omri, a sign outside the Queen's Hotel told us to expect the warmest welcome in central Scotland. The framed menu on the wall was trimmed with tartan. I caught my breath at the prices, then remembered the pile of money sitting in my account, the scant comfort of the 200 grand I hadn't earned. It was dead inside. Just one table occupied by a family with a squad of kids. A teenager stared at Alex gliding through, turning to share a smirk with a younger girl. As he reached their table, Alex clocked the toddler in her high chair and made a big face to the child's enchantment. When I was out with Alex, there was always a tension. One day we passed a group of young white boys, barely high school age, on the street. "Packy," one of them said, quietly but with feeling. The word came at me like a fist, but Alex strode on, and I couldn't then bring myself to ask whether he had heard. As we opened our menus, I noticed someone half hidden on the other side of the bar. Whoever was there was smiling, sliding down from a stool. "Oh, you're here." Kit Ross sank down next to Alex, who flinched at her proximity. I began explaining our search for the house. The screen of Alex's phone started awake. "I'd better just have a look at this." Kit watched his retreating back. "You know, he is so familiar to me, your friend." "Oh, he's an actor. He's been in loads of things, ads and dramas and films and plays, and he does voiceovers. He did this big BBC drama about terrorists." I nodded towards the empty seat. "He's a slave to his phone. Never knows when he's going to get the call." "And what is it you do, Jamie?" "Me?" I stared, unused to having my name handed to me with such an attentive look. I told her I was an art teacher, noting the tilt of her head as she absorbed this. What a wonderful job. I smiled, not wishing to disabuse her. I had become a teacher because my parents wanted me to be a teacher, and because I wanted to give them this thing they wanted as a gift or a way of atoning. I fell into it, to be honest. I tapped my crushed coaster against the table. A portrait painter. That's my unlived life. I imagine teaching must be very rewarding. Let's just say I enjoy the little moments of gratification, like when a lesson provokes a flicker of interest in the student that I thought I'd lost forever to the view from the classroom window. That is nice. "You're lucky," she said. Lucky. Yes, I was lucky. I had sold my parents' house for around 2/3 of the amount their next-door neighbours got for theirs, but compared to everyone else, I knew I was up to my arse in assets. "The thing is," I heard myself say, "I've always drawn. Ever since I can remember, it's almost a compulsion. It always made me feel less alone. Only lately, these past few months, I haven't drawn at all. I can't get it together to even, not a stroke, and I'm worried that if I don't draw, if I can't draw, then I won't. I'm worried I'll feel alone again." I wasn't used to talking unguardedly about myself. Somehow her eyes gave me permission. On and on I rambled, my face growing warm, and she bent her head towards me, a sign shining out from her eyes that said, "I know just what you mean." Tat, tat, tat. Alex at the window, still with his phone clamped to his ear, pointed towards the bar and waggled a cupped hand in front of his mouth, the universal signal for Diet Coke. Kit Ross rapped the table. "Well, I suppose I should get on," she said. "Jamie, if you need anything, please just holler." She spoke slowly, her long vowels landing mid-Atlantic. I found it endearing, the rolled R giving way to a guitar twang. She smiled as she got up. "Can you guess where I'm from?" "Canada. But I'm a Scot, really. Rural Ontario wasn't for me. I always knew I'd come back over here one day." Alex eventually came back to the table. "What was it?" "Voiceover for RBS. Weirdly, they're not all that keen on Scottish accents now. Geordie and Brummie are the thing, apparently." We walked back along the track, with the light softening the forest's edges. Alex was downbeat at first, but then he slipped his arm through mine and we danced like Dorothy and the Scarecrow, a few steps side to side as the forest grew up around us. On the doorstep, we found a Tupperware box with a note. I always go over the score. "Save me from myself, K.R." Alex prized open the lid. "Tablet." He pushed a chunk into his mouth. "Well, she doesn't have to ask me twice." "Come in, dear children. I promise you shall eat to your heart's desire." And he took another piece. Someone, a neighbour, left a fruit loaf on the doorstep a couple of days after my mother died. When I pulled back the foil, the cake was still a little warm. I never did find out who left it there. My mother was quiet, but she could be bold. At 50-something, she decided to learn to drive. Through an ad in the paper, she bought an old Fiat and talked an acquaintance into giving her lessons. She paced the flat while my father and I quizzed her on her highway code. "I can't do this," she complained. "Why did I even get into this?" When she passed her test first go, we all climbed into the banger, and she drove at regal pace to Portobello, where we sat on the bench, eating chips out of the paper. It was a perfect evening. We watched the day dissolve itself. My mother had a gleam about her. I was grateful for the man who sat down with me after that long, feverish journey home. I had driven for 10 hours overnight. He placed a hand on my back and steered me through the weird-smelling building, offering tea, coffee, hot chocolate, toast, if I was hungry. He looked so sad, so genuinely pained, that I wanted to say something that would lighten him. He told me my mother had lost control on a patch of black ice. She and the car went through a wooden fence into a ditch. There were no other vehicles involved. The road was unusually quiet. "The medical examiner has told us she would have died pretty much instantly," the man said. And all I heard was pretty much. "She was unlucky," he said. It was that word, unlucky, that made my legs flood cold. I felt my core tighten and the man placed a box of tissues in front of me. "Had your mother had any other bumps or scrapes that you know of?" I shook my head. And when his gaze didn't shift, I wonder if I should start telling him about all the ways that my parents were careful. All throughout their lives. My mother was a steady driver who always kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. How else to explain her? Perhaps I should tell him about my father's morning habit of presenting his newly shaved face for my mother to kiss, or that they tended to bicker in the supermarket and had to divide up the shopping list to avoid further argument, or that my mother hung onto my father at parties because he was ever so slightly more socially adept than she was. Careful people. Maybe I would have that inscribed on their gravestone, or maybe a one-word epitaph. Careful, as both description and warning. I laughed into my coffee and the man looked down at his clasped hands. I'm afraid we'll never know precisely what happened, he said. My father died in August 2018. Mum in November. At least they're together now. Someone, a friend, said that to me not long after Mum died. I held on to that thought as everything moved around me in the weeks afterwards. All the houses in my parents' row were the same. A bay window with two smaller ones above, and a roof like a blunt-cut fringe. The gardens were small, but that didn't stop people from going to town. Planting, sculpting the lawn, adding bird stations and tiny ponds. In distance terms, it was barely a mile away from where the shop had been located, but it felt a world away from the sinewy networks of the old town. I opened the door to a ringing silence. Since Dad died, my quiet mother had grown to dislike silence. Sometimes she left the radio playing in the bedroom while she pottered around downstairs, as though concerned the upstairs would get lonely. A smell of soaked fruit. Christmas cake. My mother liked to be organised. She was here, alive, only yesterday. That night, as I climbed the stairs, I found myself thinking about the day we came to view this house, 16 years ago. My father was wearing his one and only suit because this was an important occasion. Isn't it just like I said? I thought the rooms were smaller than they had looked in the photos. People in books retired to the home of their dreams. This place was low-ceilinged, a blank. This was what they had spent their lives working towards. It was what they could afford, my mother kept reminding me, especially as they had been saving up to help me out with college. An ill-favoured thing, sir, began my mother, glancing towards my father. But mine own. Now I found the spare room that had lapsed into a drying room cum store cupboard. My mother had called it the glory hole, which made me want to put my hands over my ears and start singing. I groped for the narrow bed. The dark settled, divulging shapes. The plastic tub in the corner was full of my old books and toys. My parents were more sentimental about these things than I was. My father became so attached to certain pieces that my mother would have to disappear them into the loft, purgatory, before the charity shop. I got out of bed and rootled in one of the boxes, pulling out chipped Star Wars figures. Here was poor one-legged action man, still sporting the tank top Mum knitted for him when I complained he was cold. A mound of books. The one on top was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The photograph on the cover was of a muddy-looking boy with great teeth, dressed in overalls, standing in front of a lake and holding up a huge fish. I had loved that boy. I used to lie in bed and wonder why Huck Finn made my throat choke with sadness. Right at the bottom of the box was one of my high school paintings, pretentiously titled Beach After a Storm. Landscapes were never really my thing. I had always preferred faces. I only showed my parents these creations because they seemed to lighten them. The canvas was layered with acrylic. White, turquoise, navy, black, all the darkness concentrated on one corner. I had copied it from a photograph my father had taken on a family holiday to Cornwall. The mass of retreating cloud looked like it was going to demolish the horizon. This was my mum's favourite. In the night, standing peeing, I spotted the sleeve of my father's dressing gown poking out from behind the bathroom door, and the sight of it undid me. Alex was shooting a public health commercial in the Lake District. He'd been cycling up and down a hill in pissing rain for 2 days. He'd wanted to come straight away, but I had made my voice light on the phone. Now I battered out a text. When you here? Seconds later, okay, I can get a lift. I'm coming. He was with me by lunchtime. He would be with me when I went to the hospital. He was there when I met the undertaker and the minister. He was there, of course, for the funeral. dialing his smile high for all the people I had never met or even heard of. And Councillor Waddell, no longer a councillor, who took my hand in both of his and said, "How are you doing, Jamie? Anything you need. Anything at all." Alex stepped forward. He found for me the words that all of a sudden wouldn't form. Mum. The easiest sound to make. Barely a word. Mum, 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 mum. The heating came on with a snap, the warm pulsing through the pipes without hurry. I wore his scarf while I cooked. We fell into bed, the two of us complaining about the cold like it was a fickle friend. After we had gone back over the day, he stretched for his magazine while I lay on my side, watching him. I asked what he was reading, and he held out the mag so I could see. The item was called Letter to My 16-Year-Old Self. Do you remember what you were like when you were 16? I was a clown, he said. When you're the runt of the litter, you'll do pretty much anything for attention. You didn't mind folk laughing at you, looking at you? When I walked down Kippen Road in eyeliner with my hair back combed to bejesus, the neighbours shook their heads and called their kids over. The same little asswipes, incidentally, that threw muck at me on the way to school. My brothers pretty much disowned me. He drew breath. Plus, we were the only brown people for miles around. It's not like I could escape notice. Catholics to boot. I hadn't thought about 16 for so long that it only came back to me in still pictures. I remember my fascination with the boys who seemed so at home in their damp skins. Funny how the scariest boys were the ones you wanted to notice you. Did you know you were? Oh, yeah. I tried not to think about it, though. Alex kept his eyes on me. I tried not to look away. I'd grown up keeping secrets. I didn't feel like hiding from Alex. Whenever I had a moment alone, when I was in the bath or lying in my bed, and it came back to me that I was one of those, it made me feel, well, I know. His mouth quirked. Imagine if we'd known each other all those years ago. School, all that. We might have been friends. I thought about this, staring down at the covers, and when I turned back, his eyes were closed. I huddled against him until it felt safe to turn out the light. I still think of big school as something I survived. The building was vast, the playground and toilets full of soft, bearded boys holding territory. The air thrummed with constant alert-making sound. I fled to the library where I spent the breaks reading with my coat on. Catcher in the Rye, Kidnapped, Lord of the Flies. But I could never find myself on those pages. I was there, at least in the mirrors my father's glasses made whenever the light shone on them. James Haley, boy, but not a boy. At least not in the way the boys in the bogs were boys. It was in the library that I started to draw. At first, it was a way of passing time. I spent hours copying pictures out of books, worrying at bits of faces. My father discovered my sketchbook. "These are yours." He turned the book on its side. "Not bad. Must have taken a lot of work." Old Mac, the head of art, was more eloquent. I had what he called a facility. "You have a rare facility, James." I loved the art room with its Jackson Pollocked tables, the shelves of supplies. Old Mac saw that I loved drawing, and he let me sit in the classroom during my breaks. On report night, he told my parents that I should be thinking about art school. "Oh, well, you always were very creative, Jamie," my mother said. And now I just have to smile. Creative, sensitive, artistic. The rusty words they use to explain my lack of interest in football or fighting. They walked me home that night, deflated. Their expectation for me was that I would graduate to a professional title, doctor, lawyer, or engineer, a single word they could hand customers in the shop along with their change. "I suppose you could become an art teacher," my father said, and that seemed to cheer them both. Mum slapped a kiss onto my head. I felt a grin creeping across my face. They were proud of me. Light again. Kit was tucked behind the wheel of her 4x4. "Just shift all that junk onto the floor," she said, sweeping away a pile of newspapers, books, and a couple of travel cups. "Well, what an adventure." She fired the engine. We passed through Omri, and then there was more forest, the pines arranged in regimented rows. The tip of the loch came into view. The road narrowed, and at that moment the rear view mirror filled with Alex's profile. "There!" We said it together. I could feel my heart pulsing upwards. I looked up towards the cottage, dumped halfway up the hill. "How did you know where to find it?" "I put on my deerstalker and I asked around." The path went up at a steep angle. The house was almost as I remembered, a long bungalow, the walls doughy in colour. I climbed towards Alex and pointed at the small end window. "That was my room," I said. It was freezing and there was no central heating, but I was warm in my sleeping bag. He pulled my hand to his mouth and kissed it, then stepped away, spreading his arms. The house, his gift to me. Alex seemed about to march down the path that ran haphazard down the side of the building. Kit put out a hand. "Maybe we should try knocking." He led the way, finding a door that opened onto a glass-fronted vestibule. A woman was leaning out of the interior door, her ashen hair billowing out of a grey fleece. I saw 4 or 5 bags for life dropped around the place. The woman was almost bent double. "Give you a hand?" She lifted her head. "Aye, well, if you wouldn't mind, son, that's good of you." She straightened slowly. "You'll be all right to bring those into my kitchen, will you, son?" The smell transported me instantly to my parents' living room. I could taste the second-hand smoke on the back of my tongue. The woman lifted pink-rimmed eyes to where Alex was standing, squinting along a row of knickknacks. "You visiting from somewhere?" "They're up from London," Kit said. "Aye, but where are you from, son?" "Fintry." "Fintry? Scotland?" She squinted. "Well, there was a couple staying over in Omri. Wee boy. I used to see them on the bus. They were from somewhere. Syrian Muslims. Nice lassie. He wasn't working." There was a thundering silence, which Kit stepped into. "The reason we're here is that this young man," I fluttered my fingers, "remember staying in your house when he was a wee boy." She contemplated me. "So, you stayed in this house?" Maybe." "Aye, well, go on then. Jog your memory." I joined Alex in the living room, and we stood there for a moment, pressed into the middle of the floor by a tidal wave of bric-a-brac. We opened the door outwards onto a corridor carpeted red. The air was cold, full of the same acrid smell. Alex went straight for the door at the end of the corridor, felt the handle, then pushed against something blocking the way. The room was tiny and awash with boxes. There was no clear path through to the window. Alex raised himself and tried to see the view. "I'm not even completely sure this is the right house," I said, and he laughed, louder than he needed to. Outside I surveyed the house, trying again to make it 25 years younger in my head. It had seemed a hellish journey, involving several buses and a laden trek upwards. "I'm not doing this again," my father managed on the exhale. We'd arrived late in the day and the house had given us a cold welcome. "No, don't sit down," my mother said. "Can we at least unpack?" The next morning, they were able to properly take in their surroundings. My father hobbled outdoors in bare feet, clutching his binoculars. I spent hours with my sketchpad. Mum lost afternoons in a deck chair, reading her way through a pile of vicious-looking paperbacks. In the evenings, we played Scrabble, and my mother laughed when my father tried out risque words. We walked around the loch, stopped to eat and dabbled the water. Their movements were light. Their edges had softened. All I have are impressions. My father, his laughing head framed against a window, bedtime reading made more thrilling by the novelty of the surroundings, sliding around in my sleeping bag. I turned away from the house. I remember the early summer of my 18th year as a time of giddy expectation. There was talk of my parents getting rid of the shop and buying a house. I had done well. I had seen the extent of their pride when the brown envelope was opened and handed over. A week later, I watched my mother unwrap the framed copy of my results and arrange it against the living room wall. My father's smile was a mile wide. I wanted to take a picture. I will have this forever, I thought. And so, I chose that moment to tell them I would be leaving. "London?" My mother turned to my father, bewildered. My father sucked his teeth. "You don't want to rush into anything now?" What? How many times had I heard them say that the world was my oyster? Like so many Scots of their generation, they measured success as being in direct proportion to the number of miles a person put between themselves and their homeland. Was this not what they wanted? When term started, I stood at the edge of a group I hadn't been invited to join, until I finally forced myself to say something. Gradually, we formed one large circle. We laughed at every glib comment. There were lots of questions for me about Scotland and Edinburgh. Did I hate the English? And what were hires anyway? We sat and drank coffee and smoked in the college bars and around the massive tables in the central lounge of the student residence. The conversation went from surface to deep in the space of one short toke. "So who's out here?" said a girl with a skull cap of black hair, her hand in the air. A couple more hands went up. "I'm by," said one boy with half a hand up. I held my mug in front of my face, unsure at first what they were talking about. I realised, after a moment, that every eye was on me. Slowly, I raised a hand. Priya, who had asked the question, leaned forward and smiled as if to say, "See, that wasn't so difficult now, was it?" And the realisation went through me like a fright. It was easy. When I called my parents, I pictured my father in the front room of the new house, holding up the phone so my mother could listen. A bundle of my housemates went past. "Where are you speaking from?" my mother said, hearing their chatter. "You sound a bit funny," my father said. "What's happened to your voice?" "Matthew, sounds like he's sucking on sour plumes," I heard my father say. After we graduated, my friends and I got it together enough to organise a group show in a gallery in Walthamstow. Through the same gallery, I made some more sales, and my large canvas portraits were included in a show in Hoxton. For a while I was having fun. Everything seemed possible. But not long after, when I looked at my life with a cold eye, I realised how broke I was, how tired and out of shape I felt. To keep going, you need money. So there were jobs in cafes and restaurants, evening shifts in offices, punching numbers into keyboards from 6 to 10. For a time, I went with my office colleagues to their pubs after work. I stuck around for as long as I could. Went home when the collars and tongues got loose. "Oh, you're gay, right? My gay friends are a blast. They're the life and soul." While they waited expectantly, I grinned like a clown. gurned until my face hurt. I was fine, I told myself. I was self-contained. I was in London, for God's sake. I travelled across town on the tube for hookups. I started canvases, then abandoned them. I mislaid my sketchbook and made a half-hearted search. I devoted my creative energies to carving hearts in froth and garnishing pies. The rest of it, art, ambition, wafted away. I stopped looking for my sketchbook. I embarked on a career of couchsurfing, everything I needed stuffed into one bag. "How are you doing?" my parents asked. I was calling from my mobile, using free minutes because I didn't have access to a house phone anymore. I was selling paintings, I told them, getting commissions. I had a lovely flat in Paddington, where the couch I was residing on happened to be. I had turned my spare room, in London, into a studio. "Well, I'm assuming this means you won't be coming home to see us any time soon," my father said. I couldn't afford the train, so I took the megabus. When I arrived at the bus station in the evening, I went into the toilets and changed my shirt and socks, combed my hair and brushed my teeth, cleaned my specs, sprayed deodorant, every corner tucked in. Mum was inching along Queen Street in the car. "Traffic's terrible." Then, an acknowledgement I was there. "Did you have a good trip?" Back at their crowded estate, she slotted the car home. "Well, I'd better get inside and check on your father." But she didn't move. She sat for a few moments before unbuckling her belt. "It's good that you're here," she said. "Gives us all a wee shot in the arm." For tea, when she put the plate on the table, my father just smiled at it. After a moment, she got up and began cutting his lasagna into ever smaller pieces. When my father didn't respond, she forked one of the chunks, then put the implement in his hand. He held up the fork, turned it around, smiling. My father went to bed around 8:30. My mother went with him, signalling for me to stay put. Later I watched her smoking at the back door, looking out into the darkness. When she came back in, she told me she was going to make a tea. She had her back turned to me as she rattled the jar and mugs with more vigour than I had ever seen her use before. And then I began. I had practiced by rote, but when my mother didn't say anything, I kept going, making strings of words out of body as though this was happening to someone else. She lifted her mug, pushed her hair out of her face. "Are you hearing me, Mum?" She whirred her spoon in her tea. "Your life will be hard. You'll be lonely. People will laugh at you. Look, I won't say anything to Dad if you don't want me to." For a moment her face seemed to break. "Oh, I suppose he knows." The next day, I watched my parents go through the many slow rituals that made up their life now. My mother went from one task to another without a sigh, but I could see she was angry. She could barely look at me. I knew what to do. I would train to be an art teacher. I would give her this thing she wanted. I would work hard at it. And perhaps this would give her the shot in the arm she needed. Alex sat with his back against the sofa. He asked what I wanted to do the next day. "Let's drive somewhere." He stretched out across the floor and felt for his phone. "Oh," he sat up. "You mind that radio documentary series, Scotland's Gin-Making Phenomenon? I've got a call back." He scrolled. "Oh, for fuck's sake." "What?" "It's tomorrow. I'll leave it." He continued to stare at the screen, his mouth turning down at the corners. "Come on," I said. "You can be up and back in a day. I'll be fine. He raised himself. You sure? I pressed my hand into his, jiggled his fingers to show how light I was. Bed then, mister. But what will I do tomorrow? What will I do with all those hours? The next morning, Alex threw his bag over his shoulder and yanked open the door. There, in the frame, was Kit Ross, a jumbo carton of orange juice under her arm. You look like you're off out somewhere. Only to Glasgow. An acting job. I'm leaving this one holding the fort. Alex squeezed my shoulder. What an exciting life you boys lead, Kit said, beaming. The car lumbered out of sight. Slowly, I took off my glasses, pretending to clean them on my sleeve. I got far too much orange juice at the shop, Kit was saying. What are we going to do now? Said the little boy. We're all alone. She beckoned me. Let's go inside. We were out together, Alex and me, when I got the call about my father. We sat down on a bench at a bus stop. For a moment I considered not telling him. He might try kindness, which I didn't want, or he might make his excuses, get on the next bus. We'd only known each other a couple of months. We were having fun. I thought I wanted nothing more than his fun. Alex put a hand over mine, and for a good while we stayed like that, with me holding his hand, not saying anything. When I got back to London after the funeral, he came over. He stood in the doorway with his head down, hands clasped below his chest, so he looked like he was praying. I went to give him a peck. He curled his arm around me. Your dad. I'm sorry. I didn't want him to let go. Kit discarded her coat on a chair by the front door. Underneath, she wore a formless cardigan over a yellow football top. A baubled badge. Brazil, it said. Oh, this is one of Terry's old things, she said. I followed her down the hallway to the kitchen, where a shy glow was coming in through the French windows. The wall to my right told a story in gallery form, beginning in an era when people sat stiff and unsmiling, progressing all the way to pouting and peace signs. A large, framed photo assaulted my attention. A man with his family, 2 children, almost teenaged. Kit marched around the breakfast bar and began rustling in the bread bin. She lifted out a couple of croissants, which she tipped onto plates. Can I ask, is that your son? That's Terry. And Paula. They're married. And Callum and Daisy. He's like you. Terry. It's the chin, right? She leaned to the side, contemplating the picture. I'm not his mother, of course. Then, seeing my face, she added, I mean, in the most important sense, of course I am, but the fact is, it was my sister Annabelle who... She mined something large and heavy exploding out of her stomach like the creature in Alien. Oh, wow, I mean, she tried. You know, she really did try. I can remember her bathing him in those early days, and she seemed fascinated by the smell of his head and his tiny hands and feet, but she was so easily bored. I didn't mean to become his mother. I had my own plans. She shrugged, her head lowering. For a moment I wondered if she would speak again. As I was heading for my car, with Terry holding me by the hand with his little backpack on, it hit me hard. My God, this is going to be so hard. But maybe this was what I was supposed to do. She looked up again, looked at me with such concentration that I had to turn away. I mean, it's all hard, Jamie. She got to her feet. Rummaging in a drawer, she plunged her hand right to the back. Got you. She unfurled a plastic pouch, rummaging again until she unearthed a packet of fag papers. Come on then. She ushered me towards the French windows. My thigh met the back of a wooden bench as I stepped out onto the patio. Kit flicked a switch and the lawn materialised before us. I huddled in my corner of the bench as Kit fashioned the joint. She kept her attention on me as I drew the smoke into my lungs. I handed back the joint, and again our eyes met. She was sitting directly beneath the garden light. The white of her hair seemed almost to glow. I felt her shift across the bench towards me, and it was only then that I realised I was crying. "Sorry. I'm sorry. Thought I was such a big man. I used to have all this stuff I had to do." My mouth was open, my vision was blurred. I put a hand to my face, but I couldn't stop the outpour. "What if I forget the shape?" I managed to say. "What if I forget the shape of them?" A great sob. "I'm so sorry, you don't know me." Kit handed me a tissue, and I couldn't help myself. I started talking. The whole long story punctured with apology, and then I pressed my lips, desperate not to cry. She waited. "There are days when it feels like they're everywhere around me," I said. "I mean, I don't believe in anything. I'm a downright atheist, but sometimes it feels like they're looking out for me, watching over me, and sometimes it feels like they're looking down and seeing things about me that they won't. You know, we all feel like that sometimes. Every one of us feels like that one time or another. I should have at least have had the chance to thank them. No need." I was crying again. She took my hand, pulling it into her lap, pressed her other hand down on mine. "I don't want to forget," I said, my voice quiet. "I don't want them becoming just people, you know, people whose faces I can barely recall." "You won't forget," she said, and as I closed my eyes, I saw the two of them. My mother and father, photo real, dream real. Those thrice weekly phone calls, heads pressed to the receiver, their lack of complaint or intrusion. She pulled herself up in her seat. "You fold it all into you. All the things, good and bad, and you just go on." Back we went, down the hallway. And this time I saw that one of the doors had a little candy-striped sign, "Callum and Daisy's room." "They visited a couple of years ago," Kit said. "I did up this room for the kids." "Where are they?" "Sacramento, California. It's my turn to visit, but I don't like planes. Terry wanted to live near my sister. She's settled now, and she's been married for 20 years. To the same guy. And Terry has all these half-brothers and sisters, and the kids have all these cousins." Kit laughed. "I wouldn't have believed it. My sister is now all the things she never thought she would be. She's a matriarch." Her shoulders heaved at the thought. "I'm happy for them." I searched her face, but there was nothing there. No trace of bitterness or resentment. She carried on gazing at the little coloured sign for a moment, her smile as full and fond as ever, before turning to show me out. In the apartment, I sat on the bed. I blew a raspberry at Baby Bear. I wondered if it was too early to call Alex. Maybe this would be my life now. Money in the bank, all worries, all sadness gone, the freedom to do fuck all. I opened my book and pressed my face into the page. In that moment, I felt close to them, though I knew they were nowhere nearby. And then, a sensation, growing, of something struggling to get out. I couldn't stop the sense that there was something else I needed urgently to do. So finally, I burrowed in my holdall, unearthed my sketch pad in an eruption of socks and underwear. I had bought it new for the trip, with no real intention of using it. It took a while to push beyond the tetchiness I felt at how it hurt my hand to do this now, the disdain I felt towards my first drafts. She started to come through in the eyes and the wing mirror ears, and the way that the pieces of her face seemed to coalesce around her smile. I would post the picture through her door before we left. "What are we going to do now?" said the little boy. "We're all alone." "We shall have to spend the night here in the forest," said the girl. "It's the only thing to do." I almost didn't notice my phone was buzzing. "Alex." "How did it go?" "They want me back. Tomorrow. I can stay with Sarah and Joe. It's between me and one other guy. The producer said he's going to let it marinate overnight. I know. What a wanker." "Okay. Break a leg." "You'll be all right." "We shall have to spend the night here in the forest. It's the only thing to do." "Hurry back," I said. Sometimes I find myself missing things that never happened. More than once I have pictured Alex ducking through the door of their house, lighting up every room like Tinkerbell. At first, the presence of this alien prince at her table would have unnerved my mum. He would have gone out of his way to put her at ease with his offers of help and interested questions. My father would try his best, too. He would likely refer to Alex as my friend, as though we were two single guys sharing a bed for reasons of economy. Maybe I would correct my father. "He's my boyfriend," I would say, my voice murder. "My lover. My husband." Or maybe I'd rise above. Let be. Whenever I think about Mum bringing my father home for the first time to meet my grandmother, I picture them either end of the sofa. My grandmother, this woman I never met, might have offered Dad a small glass of beer, which he would have accepted out of politeness. There would be discreet but significant questions. "Where's home?" Answer, 3 streets away. "What does your father do?" Answer, "He works in a garage over in London Road, but we don't expect that to last." "What do you want to do with your life?" Answer, "A whole cascade of things." My father was never short of ideas. My grandmother leaves the room to boil the kettle, signalling with a wave for my parents to stay put. And when they're sure they're alone, they turn their bodies inwards. They reach for each other and they gaze down at their laced fingers. And this is maybe my favourite image of them. This picture of subdued hope.